Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on feminist foreign policy. Thank you for coming. And first of all, happy International Women's Day. It's a very timely discussions that we are having today, and I'm glad to also welcome our speakers. My name is MARYLIA HUSHCHA. I'm research assistant at the International Institute for Peace, and I will be moderating this session. This event is organized in cooperation with the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, and I'm also very glad to welcome SASKIA STACHOWITSCH, who is the scientific director there. Saskia, also welcome to you. So as a short introduction, maybe I would say a couple of words by mentioning that last year we marked many anniversaries related to women's role in international relations. And most notably, it was the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security that celebrated 20 years of its implementation, of its adoption. But beyond marking and celebrating anniversaries, there has been also some real work, some substantial work done on the international level, also by states, to incorporate gender perspective in international politics and include more women in decision-making processes. So one of the recent trends has been the adoption of a feminist foreign policy by several states, such as Sweden, Canada, Mexico, and France. And we are also happy to welcome Kelly Anderson here, who is a representative of the Canadian Embassy in Vienna, and she will talk more about how this is done in practice. Today, we are going to discuss different expectations of feminist foreign policy that also go beyond promoting gender equality. And this includes the alleviation of poverty and the abolishment of militarism and other issues. We'll also discuss feminist foreign policy as a concept and in practice, what has been achieved so far and what challenges remain there. So I will actually introduce in more detail our speakers as they give their opening remarks. For the beginning, for the procedure, I would like to say that our audience can ask their questions in Q&A session here, in Q&A box here on Zoom. And we're also live streaming this event on Facebook, so you can also comment there, and I will try to check it from time to time. So I would like to start with Saskia Stachowitsch, who is a professor of international politics at the University of Vienna and the scientific director of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. She was an Elsi Richter Research Fellow of the Austrian Science Fund, and she was an affiliated scholar at the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and a visiting scholar at the School in International Relations and Privatization of Security, Gender and the Military, and other. Saskia, please, the floor is yours. You have got around 8 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, MARYLIA. Hi, and welcome from the second host institution of this event, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, the OIIP. We have dedicated much of our energy and time in research and policy consultancy and public outreach on issues around feminist international relations, gender and security in the last few years. So many thanks to the IIP and you, MARYLIA, for initiating this joint event. Well, feminist foreign policy, first of all, let me say that I think it's a quite bold move by state authorities in these times to call anything feminist, with feminism in many circles being perceived as almost a dirty word. And just imagine for a moment, if you're not from one of those very few countries that do actually have a feminist foreign policy, that your foreign affairs minister or similar would come forward and proclaim that he, or in very few cases she, will from now on pursue a feminist agenda in foreign policy. Right, it's quite unthinkable. And that even after 2 decades, MARYLIA has mentioned this already, of the Women, Peace and Security agenda of the UN, which has paved an understanding, a basic understanding that gender matters in international and security politics, I would say even within more conservative policy elites. But WPS, as it's abbreviated, not incidentally, mostly avoids any association with feminism or the concept and the rhetoric of feminism. Still, feminist foreign policy is out there, countries are doing it, and I think that in itself is remarkable. However, 2 caveats, and one is the more obvious: it's not enough to claim a label. But second, and this is more complicated, what does feminism mean in this context? To us, to policymakers, to the wider population. And I think here one could have a rather narrow definition, narrow understanding of feminism, that it's, basically about promoting gender equality in and through foreign policy, that it is a foreign policy that would reflect on its effects on gender relations at home and abroad, and that strives to include women into the institutions that are conceptualizing and implementing foreign policy. But I think many feminists would contest this definition, and that policymakers choose to label something feminist, to me, somehow suggests that they are ready also to engage with feminist scholars and activists on these matters, which, again, I think is very brave of them. But what would such a more broader definition of feminism look like? Well, it would certainly entail a critical stance toward power, toward state power, toward institutional power. It would include an anti-militarist, a pacifist agenda. And I think most importantly, it would have an intersectional understanding of gender that does not equate gender with women, that does not marginalize other structures of powers in terms of race, sexuality, ability, in favor of a narrow understanding of gender in terms of women's issues. And I think this would consequentially entail a fundamentally different way of understanding what foreign policy even is and what its purpose is. And it strongly suggests a move away from the logics and rhetoric of geopolitics, state interest, global governance, and more traditional understandings of security. So the first question I think that we always have to pose is, what does feminism mean if we talk about feminist foreign policy? And my second question would be also, again, relating to MARYLIA's intro, what is the relationship between feminist foreign policy and the WPS agenda? And I'm very interested to hear what my fellow panelists would say to that. So what does feminist foreign policy add that women, peace and security agenda can't or couldn't? To put it in a slightly provocative way, maybe, is feminist foreign policy more than the commitment of nation-state actors to finally implement WPS? And if it is that, maybe that is also enough. We know that WPS has a huge implementation problem, and that there's rather big gaps between different countries in terms of national action plans, in terms of updating and evaluating and moving forward with the agenda. But beyond these concerns with implementation, there's again a bigger question, and I think that is, can feminist foreign policy overcome the pitfalls that have been identified in the WPS agenda? And that I will just briefly mention here. We can go into this in more detail later, but I would argue that these pitfalls evolve around the issue of a very depoliticized understanding of the gender and security nexus, instrumentalist, stereotypical perspectives of what women are and what skills and abilities they bring, a narrowing down of women's contribution in terms of policy effectiveness, and a framing of the agenda in ways that essentially obscures the masculine structures and work cultures in many many foreign policy institutions, and that again put undue burden on to women to alleviate these problems. Then the agenda has been criticized for an intense focus on issues of violence and women's status as victims, a shift away from empowerment and participation toward protection, and a diversion of attention, if you will, from larger socioeconomic structures that form the basis for many gendered inequalities and insecurities. And then a final criticism that has often been launched is that around masculinist protectionism and a certain white saviorism that can be inherent in the agenda, and that in the extreme serves as a kind of a neo-colonial domination strategy in the context of geopolitical hierarchies. And if we were to take feminism seriously in feminist foreign policy, then there's certainly hope that these issues are being tackled, and that feminist foreign policy is an approach that can lead to more just, egalitarian, emancipatory foreign policy. But I would suggest that we still have a lot of work to do in unpacking what feminism means here, what it entails, and how it's being implemented in the end.
Thank you very much, Saskia. You've mentioned very important points. First of all, exactly what's the definition of feminist foreign policy? Apparently, there is not a single one. And another thing, maybe if I can ask you now a short follow-up question on intersectionality. How do you see what it means in practice? How does it change the foreign policy approach?
That's a difficult question, and intersectionality is always difficult to implement because we're always coming from, the perspective on one structure of inequality, and then when we venture into it, then realizing there's more to it, right? And there's different layers, and I think radically taking one step back from the focus on women and seeing the overall power structures that inform foreign policy and marginalized communities. Transgender, racialized communities, and put that center stage, and then look at the gender implications of that. I think we will always have, a focus on one category of inequality when we start addressing an issue, and I think that's fine. But I think second step would have to be, what are the other layers? What are the other structural inequalities that we have to tackle to not constantly reify what we're trying to fight? Right? So constantly prioritizing the needs of one group over another. I know that's still a very vague question answer, but I guess my fellow panelists can add on that.
Sure, thank you very much. If someone wants to add on that, please feel free to do so. And I would like to go to our next speaker, Hanna Murdenhoff. She's an assistant professor of European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She focuses on Europe in the world at the Department of European Studies there. Her research is on the European Union's external relations, focusing on the EU's women's and LGBTQ rights promotion in Turkey and the EU's security and defense policy. She is one of the coordinators of the UACES research network, Gendering EU Studies, which aims to advance feminist research on the EU. She recently published a book titled EU Democracy Promotion and Governmentality with the Routledge Publishing House. And she also co-edited a special issue on gender in the EU external relations for Political Studies Review. Sorry. Hanna, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you for the invitation, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. Yes, and thank you, Saskia, for this good kickoff. I agree with many things you said and with many of the concerns you have. And I've also been asking myself, what's the added value of thinking about feminist foreign policy instead of really thinking about the women, peace and security agenda and implementing that in a more comprehensive and transformative way. And I haven't really found a final answer on this, and I'm also curious to hear from the other panelists. I think there are two things that have come to my mind, is that on the one hand, I do think to think about foreign policy as feminist more broadly does offer some sort of way to understand the more transformative nature of a feminist approach to foreign policy, whereas the women, peace and security agenda, I think, also has this goal, but maybe that's sometimes easier to just kind of push it to as kind of like a silo in security policy. But at the same time, I think the term as such is also already problematic because, as you mentioned also in the beginning, as a feminist foreign policy shouldn't maybe be a foreign policy any longer, because we want to overcome these ideas of kind of the domestic and the international and the othering. These are the ways that most traditional foreign policy is being done. So there's somehow also a contradiction here. And of course, we have the same dangers of, I would call it co-optation also in feminist foreign policy. And I think we also already see that partly happening. But I want to focus a bit on what the European Union is doing. And the European Union has not said it's pursuing a feminist foreign policy. And that also seems rather unlikely considering the current governments in the EU and the Council. But there are some moves there towards implementing some aspects of maybe a feminist foreign policy. The Greens have been very interested in that. And there is more and more also consideration of gender in EU external relations. Is not really new, but I think we do see some progress there. So I want to talk a bit about the gender action plan that was published in December last year in 2020, so quite recent. So that's the third gender action plan. And I think we do see here a lot of the things that Saskia already mentioned. And I think on the aspect of promoting gender equality, which obviously is not really what a feminist foreign policy is only about, but I think there the gender action plan is doing much better. But I would also like to emphasize at the same time in the following that we also see this, new emphasis or returning emphasis on geopolitics and also on militarism within EU foreign and security policies that on the one hand maybe seems to be at odds with these developments in terms of committing itself more to gender equality. But I would also argue here it might go hand in hand from the EU's perspective, at least, and that's maybe even more troubling. So we have the third gender action plan, and as I already indicated, I think we do see some progress in terms of a much more intersectional approach and to think about gender in more transformative ways and also avoiding these repetitions of gender stereotypes. We do also clearly see the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in the gender action plan. There's a lot of recognition of the importance of health policy and considering gender here. And it actually starts with the sentence that the pandemic offers the opportunity to address structural inequalities and build more inclusive societies. So that actually sounds quite promising. The GAP follows what they call a gender transformative, rights-based and intersectional approach and understands gender as a cross-cutting policy. This means that they want to do gender analysis for all EU external policy fields. And overall, it is really also stronger in terms of its intersectional approach. It, for instance, recognizes the impact of climate change on indigenous populations. But what I also notice is there's a much more consideration of the specific situation of LGBTIQ people in conflict and violence. And it links also to the EU's new LGBTIQ equality strategy much more closely than we've seen this in previous gender action plans, where this was largely excluded. And as it is also spends much more time on considering gender-based violence and in its complexities. There's a whole section on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which I find we should welcome. And it has a strong focus in health in general. And here it actually calling to improve working conditions and pay of care workers, promoting universal health care. So it's really, you can really see the impact of the pandemic here. And there are some goals that also, address more structural questions of inequality. But there's also some shortcomings, and these are some shortcomings that also Saskia already mentioned that we have seen with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It is, for instance, questionable how structural inequalities are addressed through the market-based instruments that they're proposing. So, for instance, the plan stresses women's entrepreneurship in the circular and green economy as a solution to tackle climate change. It speaks about improving women's empowerment through access to digital financial services. So we still see a very strong focus on kind of economic empowerment and entrepreneurship as a way to address these questions of structural inequalities. One other thing we find is that there's more emphasis on monitoring and evaluation than in previous gender action plans. The previous gender action plans were often criticized for being very, having quantitative indicators, so to say, for measuring progress. We still see that the gender action plan relies very much on numbers and percentages. We could maybe say there's some positive change because there's now much more elements that are supposed to be measured with the extent to which, however, also arguably still quantitative, I would say. But there are some shifts there. However, what bothers me most is how the Gender Action Plan connects its goals to the EU's migration and security policy. And I think we see if you think EU feminist foreign policy, you should immediately think migration policy. How is this supposed to go together? So the GAP says the EU should ensure that the human rights of migrant women and girls are fully realized through gender-responsive migration policy, programs and laws, and gender-responsive migration governance at global, regional, and national levels reinforced. That's kind of the only thing it says about migration policy. And I just think, how can these existing EU migration policies that are focusing on preventing migration, that have created inhumane situations on the borders, how can they be made gender responsive in any way? And I think this shows us again how the EU still thinks you can kind of infuse gender equality into existing, even most, I would say, anti-feminist policies without challenging their gendered and racialized and exclusionary nature. And similarly, the GAP's integration of the Women, Peace and Security agenda fails to reflect on what the EU is recently doing in security and defense policy. And that is a broader problem I find of the EU's implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda more generally. It often doesn't really connect to developments in security and defense policy. And I would argue that the EU has recently made a turn towards military power. And we see this, for instance, in the European Peace Facility, that's supposed to fund military operation, but it also makes it possible for the EU to directly arm third actors, something that has been strongly criticized by peace organizations in Europe, and I would say is at odds with a feminist approach to foreign policy. And overall, since the global strategy in 2016, we have witnessed the EU's ambition to move away from its norms-based approach, often more recently characterized as too soft, towards becoming a more serious and hence military actor. For instance, we've seen the recent report on the implementation of the Common Security and Defense Policy that there's a commitment to the WPS agenda, but it also emphasizes the EU's ambition for strategic autonomy, this new kind of buzzword in the EU, it seems like, but also providing the EU with a truly European defense industrial base, quote unquote. And this is one of the main goals of the security and defense policy more recently. And such ambitions have already materialized, for instance, in the European Defense Fund of 8 billion euros that comes from the EU's budget. And all of these, I think, military initiatives redirect attention and also resources to a type of security policy that is at odds with a feminist foreign policy and also with a, gender approach to EU foreign policy, which a feminist foreign policy should be people-centered, it should be a relational security approach, it should try to change border structures of inequality. Instead, the EU security policies constitute the EU as a state-like serious actor, and that's also, again, the problem with the idea of a foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy, that's ready to defend itself against a variety of threats. And this move towards military power is also, I think, an exercise in the EU trying to prove itself internationally, trying to prove its sovereignty, so to say. And this has been traditionally done through violence and militarism. And again, we see this also in the EU. So I'm highly skeptical of the EU's self-portrayal as a global frontrunner in gender equality if we think these things together. And this is still what the EU is doing. And the document, the Gender Action Plan, also talks about leading by example, which mainly refers to having numerical gender equality in key EU positions. So that's also a very limited view on gender equality and leading by example and being a frontrunner. And I think there is a danger that feminist foreign policy might be a way to reinstate the EU's liberal identity in the world. And doing so, it would reproduce hierarchical orders and other the ones considered to be less developed, less modern, less equal. And I think that's what we should be, really, what we should really pay attention to. And I think I would leave it here.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring and very, also I would say controversial kind of outlook on how the EU acts, right? So you are saying my biggest takeaway maybe from your input was that on one hand we have this gender equality strategy of the EU, but it's used for the purpose that is actually against what the gender equality is about, more or less. So, and you are saying, you mentioned yourself that it's sort of possible for the EU to reconcile currently this gender equality strategy with the growing militarization. So if maybe also short follow-up question, how would you say one can counter it, and by what means, who can we talk to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one aspect maybe that I haven't mentioned so far is that this intersectional approach in the Gender Action Plan, but also in its foreign policy, really lacks also a much broader reflection of the EU's kind of a colonial past and how these practices and discourses are also continuity of these colonial ideas and practices. And I think this needs to be maybe highlighted more or made visible more, and needs to be reflected upon much more, so that we actually prevent that a feminist foreign policy does not just mean kind of the EU considering itself to be this front runner in gender equality without really also reflecting on its own role. And also we know that this is in many cases not even really true, that we see that, for instance, the African Union has probably more progressive gender equality policy documents than the EU. So I think we should maybe challenge these ideas to really come to much more, comprehensive or transformative understanding of this. And I don't think that all the actors in the EU share the same goals, of course, but by kind of these struggles over pushing for feminist foreign policy, but then also having these other developments at the same time, you can you can end up with this kind of outcome that in the end might actually feed into each other in not very productive ways, let's say.
All right. So let us hear now from a Canadian representative some other perspective on feminist foreign policy and gender equality, how it is implemented in practice. And I would like to welcome Kelly Anderson, who currently serves as Counsellor and head of the Foreign Policy and Diplomacy section of the Canadian Embassy to Austria. Ms. Anderson joined the Department for Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 1997, and at headquarters she has worked in a variety of assignments, including Deputy Director for NATO, OIIP, and European Defence Cooperation, Deputy Director for Conventional Chemical and Biological Weapons, and most recently as Deputy Director for Space Policy and Regulation. She has served overseas at the Canadian embassies in Belgrade and Washington, D.C., and was Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva from 2011 to 2014. Ms. Anderson, Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I don't know, after the first two speakers coming at it from maybe a bit more of a practitioner's point of view and presenting Canadian feminist foreign policy, I'm a little worried about what people will think of it. But I think three of the words that I've heard here are three things that we're really striving to achieve, and that is transformational, intersectionality, and then maybe not touched on as much, but questioned, is the broad-based approach. So it really is an honor to be here to talk about Canada's feminist foreign policy. The policy was put in place in 2017, and it continues to shape and transform how Canada pursues its international objectives on the international stage, namely strengthening a rules-based international order, supporting lasting peace and security, fostering prosperity, and upholding progressive values in a way that benefits everyone. What we've seen, and certainly we're all aware, is that gender inequality is present in every country and society and is impeding half of the world's population from achieving its full potential. Its effects take many forms, from unequal political representation and pay, to gender-based violence, to a lack of access to sexual and reproductive health services, education, and skills. And we've seen COVID-19 deepen these gender inequalities. The pandemic has worsened the inequalities faced by women, girls, LGBTQ2I people, and others. Rising food and shelter insecurity, disruptions in accessing healthcare, increased exposure to violence, and serious impacts on mental health are putting the limited gender equality gains that we have made in the past decades at risk. Fundamentally, Canada's feminist foreign policy is intended to ensure that the voices of women and of other underrepresented groups are brought to the table so that they can contribute to a better future for us all. The policy aims at inclusion because it's the right thing to do, but also it's the smart thing to do. It's about advancing our interests as well as advancing the interests of those around the world. Advancing gender equality and women and girls' empowerment strengthens prosperity. It's been estimated that achieving gender equality around the world could increase global GDP by $12 trillion over 10 years. It creates sustainable peace. As I'm sure many people here know, women's participation in peace building increases the probability that peace agreements last. It reduces poverty. The World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index shows a strong correlation between gender equality and extreme poverty rates. For example, addressing the gender gap in agricultural capability could reduce global undernourishment by as many as 150 million people. So that's the why of a feminist foreign policy. But what is it exactly, at least in our context? While gender equality and inclusion have long been an important aspect of Canadian foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy has gone further by applying a feminist lens across all of Canada's international policy, advocacy, and program efforts in trade, security, diplomacy, and international assistance. So this is perhaps the answer to Saskia's question of the difference between a feminist foreign policy and the women, peace, and security agenda. It provides a framework for a suite of actions that advance our international objectives, including our trade diversification strategy, our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, our defense policy, and our feminist international assistance policy. Touching on those four pivotal documents, for us, within the feminist international assistance policy, we've committed significantly to increasing programming that will advance gender equality and empower women and girls. At least 95% of our bilateral international development investments will specifically target or integrate gender equality and empowerment of women and girls by this year. We're supporting under-resourced women's organizations and equality movements to increase their agency and capacity. We provide dedicated funding to advance human rights and improve socioeconomic outcomes for LGBTQ2I people in developing countries. Our trade diversification strategy pursues an inclusive approach to trade that aims to ensure the benefits of trade are more widely shared. We're seeking to remove barriers to trade when mainstreaming gender response provisions in our free trade agreements. We've supported the economic integration of Canadian women in the global marketplace through targeted business support programs, including the Business Women in International Trade program. At the same time, we've supported women's economic empowerment in developing countries through initiatives that increase women's rights and strengthen their economic leadership and promote their participation in inclusive markets. Our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security provides an integrated whole-of-government approach to engagement in fragile conflict-affected and post-conflict situations. It recognizes that full and equal participation of women in peace and security efforts is essential for conflict prevention, peacemaking, humanitarian assistance to post-conflict recovery, and state building. In 2017, we launched the Elsi initiative for peace operations, which is a 5-year pilot project that aims to catalyze transformational change to increase the meaningful participation of women in UN peace operations. Our defense policy, with a focus on gender equality and diversity, is also part of the feminist approach. It commits to substantially improve recruitment, retention, training of personnel, including capitalizing on the unique talents and skill sets of Canada's diverse population. The Canadian Armed Forces will increase the proportion of women in the military by 1% annually to move from the current 15% to 25% by 2026. But the feminist foreign policy is far more than a suite of distinct policies and programs. It's truly a transformative approach of looking at what we do and how we do it. A feminist approach places a focus on dismantling persistent inequalities between men and women, boys and girls, and accounts for how other forms of discrimination may also overlap or intersect. This involves a continued, significant, and deliberate shift in processes and practices. It means we change our thinking to ensure that in all of our work we analyze and seek to eliminate systemic discrimination on the basis of sex and gender identity and expression, but also on the basis of intersecting aspects such as age, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and religion. It requires that we seek to transform patriarchal systems of power that reinforce and perpetuate inequality. And it requires that we support the voice, agency, and empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity, and of others who face discrimination or marginalization. This is a process that we have in reality just begun. Our ultimate objective is to enable all members of society to equally exercise their rights, access opportunity, and live in safety and security. It's a tall order, but to do less would deprive half of the world of the entire world of the contribution of half of its population. In terms of global change, with far-reaching challenges from climate change to the COVID-19 pandemic, that is not something we feel we can afford to do.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned that actually Canadian, that's new for me. I thought that Canadian feminist policy only extended to the international assistance, but you mentioned trade and diplomacy in other sectors, also security, which is very good to hear. But I have a question, maybe a bit critical one, actually. How does it look for Canada in terms of defense and security policy? Because Canada is still an arms exporter, and this is something what feminist foreign policy actually says, as I think Saskia mentioned, that it's fundamentally anti-militarist. So what would you say, how do you reconcile these two definitions maybe, or these two approaches to feminist foreign policy?
I think the first thing I'd do is I'd make a distinction between what is defined as an academic feminist foreign policy and what is a practitioner's feminist foreign policy. And maybe a practitioner's feminist foreign policy doesn't go as far as a true feminist foreign policy as defined in sort of a more academic setting. I don't think you have to rule out the role of the military in saying we have a feminist foreign policy. So this concept of it as uniquely pacifist, I think, does not fit with a reality of the world that we're working in. So yes, we still export arms. Those arms exports go through a very thorough examination, and that examination includes questions of gender and of the intersect of all of these different areas. And I think that for us would be how you look at, feminist foreign policy is, are you taking gender? Are you taking intersectionality? Are you taking all of the different issues into consideration? It's not necessarily saying, well, we won't do all this stuff because we have a feminist foreign policy, but integrating considerations into all. And, the reality is in a practical world vision, sometimes some considerations will be stronger than others, but ensuring that gender is one of those and the effects on all different communities are taken into account is a critical component of a feminist foreign policy.
Thank you, Kelly. So we've for now heard from an academic perspective, from a practitioner's perspective, and now we have another important actor in foreign policy, which is civil society. We haven't spoken about it yet. And I would like to welcome JONAS NAKONZ to also talk a little bit more about the grassroots perspective on feminist foreign policy. JONAS is a senior project manager at foraus, Swiss Forum on Foreign Policy. There, he developed multiple formats for policy dialogue and citizens' participation. His most recent brainchild is a participatory policy innovation platform called Policy Kitchen, which enabled over 200 youth and experts from 5 continents to co-create recommendations on feminist foreign policy last year. Trained in conflict analysis and resolution, JONAS currently also works as a mediator. So JONAS, welcome to this discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marylia. Happy International Women's Day to all, and thank you for the honor of inviting me to this panel. So asked to provide a little bit of a grassroots perspective on the topic, I will focus my short presentation on the participatory process Marylia mentioned and some of its outcomes. I think what I'm going to say will resonate very strongly with what has already been said. I also think that the title of today's event, Beyond Gender Equality, actually fits very well the key messages of this participatory process. I'll start with a little bit of context. So foraus, Swiss Forum on Foreign Policy, is a grassroots think tank based on the brainpower of hundreds of young volunteers here in Switzerland. We work in 12 different policy areas. Gender is one of them, but we also do migration, environment, peace and security, different things. And in the last 10 years, we've become a leading voice, I would say, in the Swiss foreign policy scene, primarily through connecting bottom-up ideas with decision makers at government and international organizations level. We're scaling this model internationally by supporting groups in other countries to set up their own participatory think tanks and try to organize cooperation among those groups under the loose umbrella of the Open Think Tank Network. And the policy kitchen that you mentioned is basically an open ideation platform or crowdsourcing platform that allows us to work together within this network with additional external partners and also the general population to brainstorm innovative solutions for specific policy challenges. So this just a little bit as a context. And then the feminist foreign policy, let's say, challenge we've done last year was actually the first joint activity we did as a network. It involved over 40 volunteers in different countries, organizing workshops, facilitation, outreach, etc. And it was framed around the very simple open question, what should a feminist foreign policy look like in the 2020s, in your eyes, as a participant? So the methodology was basically an issue mapping, like what issues should be addressed with a feminist foreign policy, and then how should they be addressed. We managed to get the participation of over 200 participants, as you mentioned, from 5 different continents. So the diversity was really amazing. It included both students, youth, civil society, but also experts from academia and people working in foreign ministries all over the place, Turkish, EU ministry, Azerbaijan, etc. And we brought them together in a series of workshops to jointly brainstorm solutions. And they were all posted on Policy Kitchen. And the internal team then looked at the data coming together. So over 90 policy recommendations were produced in context. So we looked at this and identified different clusters and then structured a publication around it. This is it. I don't know if maybe I can just post a link in the chat later on. So it's very rich, like it has fairly detailed policy recommendations in different policy areas. So I think in the time I have here, I will just brush the top level recommendations. And I think the first, or all of them actually go into the direction of pushing the boundaries of scope of a feminist foreign policy. So I would say the first key message is feminist foreign policy should be seen as a comprehensive framework for feminist foreign policy. This was very evident in the presentation of Kelly Anderson. It's not so evident in the feminist foreign policies formulated by some other countries. It's still very much attached to the women, peace and security agenda and maybe more gender sensitive development cooperation policy. And so the message from our participants is no. All foreign policy areas should be taken into consideration. What about economic and trade policy? Shouldn't we use gender disaggregated data in economic statistics? Shouldn't we account for informal work, unpaid care work in economic models and also trade agreements? What about environmental policy? Are we sure we really include the right voices? Because different people get affected differently from climate change, for instance. What about global health policy? Like a large share of the global health work force is female, but most of the global health policy decision-making are also now in the context of the pandemic, both at international and national levels. These decisions are usually done by men still. So it's really about enlarging the scope of policy areas that should be addressed with feminist foreign policy. The second one, and this has also been mentioned in previous inputs in this panel, the objective should go beyond gender equality. So the authors team in our publication put together a synthesized definition of feminist foreign policy based on that. And they're saying feminist foreign policy aims at achieving overall equality based on rights, is fundamentally pacifist, and promotes a regenerative approach to nature. So at the core of a feminist foreign policy should be an intersectional awareness and the striving for equality for all traditionally marginalized groups. And also, we've already been talking about it, like, is women, peace and security enough, or are we talking about a general demilitarization strategy, banning arms trade and pushing the disarmament agenda? The third key message is really about inclusive decision-making processes and representation in global governance and national policy. So the reality today is that still most foreign policy is done in fairly small epistemological communities. There aren't very good ways of increasing inclusiveness and representation in these decision-making processes. And that should apply again to all different areas of feminist foreign policy. I can illustrate that with an interesting case in point. So in the process, we've had the participation of feminist activists from Mexico. Mexico is widely celebrated as the first country of the global south that actually adopts a feminist foreign policy, and that's reason for celebration. However, the local activists said for them this was a pure purple washing exercise. They've never been consulted. Nobody from the government talked to civil society, and there's no civil society mechanisms for actually monitoring the progress of this feminist foreign policy. So for me personally, this inclusiveness dimension is one of the most interesting questions to talk about, because it's fairly easy to say. It's an ideal that we can all subscribe to, but to organize inclusiveness in practice is really much easier said than done. We've done a lot of work on inclusiveness before in other contexts, like inclusiveness in AI governance. And especially once you start widen the scope of your stakeholder group beyond, say, just women, it gets very complicated very quickly. Like, how do you actually organize the process of including traditionally marginalized groups who speak very different languages, maybe also than the policy community, to actually shape policy? For us, Policy Kitchen, or our very organizational model, is a little bit about prototyping ways by which governance could be designed in a more inclusive way, but it's fraught with challenges, and I'd be super happy to have a conversation about this. I think I'll end here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jonas. And I also would like to remind our participants, if they have any questions, they can submit them. But I would maybe also ask you a short follow-up question, since you have had so many participants during this process. Where would you say, which maybe areas or regions were they coming from? Like, where would you identify like the most active, participants? And linked to that, what would you say would be another country who could also adopt a feminist foreign policy?
Wow. So as to the participation, I mean, we're still a fairly Western European network in nature. The Open Think Tank Network is fairly young. We're like the second think tank was founded just 3 years ago in Berlin. So I would say that the majority of participants still was from around here. But we had about 40% participation from other continents, including, Asia and Africa and Latin America, notably. So this was actually a nice benefit of the pandemic, that we switched to virtual formats, which make this actually possible. As to what other countries could adopt a feminist foreign policy, our hope is all of them. However, we've also discussed the caveat about this notion of feminism being a little bit of a red flag to some. So the EU seemed to have made a fairly smart move with a different terminology on gender equality, and that might be necessary in some other national contexts as well. So even here in Switzerland, we had a hard time getting a lot of interest from top levels of the foreign ministry because of the very notion of feminist foreign policy. We raised a lot of eyebrows. The interest came from, gender officers and people at lower levels of the government.
Thank you very much. If any other panelists have something to add, any other comments? Saskia?
I would just briefly like to challenge this idea that we're all pursuing fundamentally different ideas and notions, and that there's a clear-cut difference between academic and practitioner and civil society perspectives. Certainly we come from different positionalities, and I think it's also a good thing that we draw this out. But just for the audience, I think it's important to understand that there's not a pure innocent academic feminism, and then there's the co-opted institutional form. Clearly feminism is entering institutions of power, and that means that feminists yield power, as Elisabeth Prügel has described in her work. So, and we know from research, the most dangerous thing we can do is cut off the conversations and not have those channels open and not challenge each other and not debate. So this is just a brief interception here.
Thank you, Kelly.
Just to agree. Certainly we need to be talking to each other. We need to be shaped by each other. We need to bring more feminism into how we as practitioners are thinking. But I think we also have to be careful about going to extremes and defining this is what, if you are feminist, you will end up here. I think it's much more about bringing in all the voices and ensuring that women's voices and other marginalized voices have as much role at the table as any other voice. Then the challenge for government becomes we have to take all those voices. We have to listen to all those voices, and we've not always been very good at listening to all of those voices. But we have to take all of those often competing interests and find the way through. So it's not going to necessarily look as perhaps a fundamentally pacifistic. That's the one I think I'm having the most challenge getting my head around. But it has to be policies, not only foreign policies, but all government policies that are listening to all voices and not only the loudest voices or the most powerful voices.
Thank you. So let me then maybe ask all of you the same question. What would be, in your view, the next step? What would you, in your position, do as an active promoter of feminist foreign policy? And what would you say your governments or the organizations you work for should and could do as the next step, a specific next step? If anyone wants to start.
I can start. From my perspective, it would be, to a certain extent, more of the same, but more of the same in terms of transformation. As I mentioned, we're at the very beginning of this, and it's not only a mindset change for broad government policy, it's a mindset change for every single employee within my department. And I think that's a process that's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick, but it's something that we have to continue to do. So reinforcing the idea that we do have to go out, we do have to hear from others, we do have to think about the consequences of every policy and action we take, which can be more work, that can make decision-making more challenging, but ultimately should make decision making more inclusive. And I think that's what we have to continue to do.
Thank you.
Maybe I can follow up. Yeah, I mean, I think what I would also like to underline the fact that we're talking about the feminist foreign policy is, of course, also a good sign, let's say. I mean, it means that it has entered the policy field. It is, we have something we can talk about. And, that's why we have these events, and that's why we can connect with different, from academic or practitioners, grassroots perspectives. So I think that is indeed a chance, of course. And I do also think that the anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda has provided this chance to talk more about these questions. And I think this is something we should make use of and continue this conversation, and also really, question a bit of the underlying assumptions. So I do think this is an opportunity to reflect more broadly on what it means to do foreign policy, and try to now already kind of intervene before, let's say, we just have this label and it's not really going to do what we want it to do. I mean, of course, this is a long process, and every step, towards, what I would consider the right direction is welcome. And I know there are, of course, also actors struggling, what I was talking about within the EU institutions, and they have to make strategic choices. So that's, of course, also, something we need to recognize when we study these questions. And for an academic, it's, of course, much easier to say, this is not enough. I also recognize that. So I do think this is a good opportunity and a good time to have these conversations. And it's also a really important time to have these conversations, because we do see a lot of things going a different way right now. And that is, I think it's essential for us to keep on pushing. And I personally do think where we see things going a different way is very much with this kind of return of geopolitics and return of questions about power as military power. And I think this is one of the things we do need to oppose and criticize if we are serious about transforming foreign policy.
Thank you, Hanna. Jonas, Saskia?
Maybe my answer to the question would be, I like the approach to change of prototyping good ideas, showing what works and talking about it. So I think it's really brilliant to have a bunch of first movers on the planet, like Canada, like Sweden, and now to a large extent also the EU, making cases and also giving other countries an opportunity to observe the outcomes. It's very much discourse work. So within foreign ministries, there's hundreds of minds that get bombarded with different messages and language. So I think it's about getting language to those ears, good cases, making it sexy, interesting, and also maybe specifically in the feminist arena, try to work with male allies as much as you can. They're out there, but they're maybe rare. But I think this will help getting legitimacy also in more conservative, government circles.
Thank you. Saskia, would you like to add something?
Well, I just thought about the Austrian case of what would be necessary, the logical next steps. And I think here the answer is really easy. Update, evaluate, implement National Action Plan on WPS. This is not being done enough. And I think in the Austrian case, it would be quite problematic if we would silo the issue of feminism into foreign policy ministry, because it's so underfunded. So I think in our case, it's better to have a perspective that includes the Ministry of Defense, that will eventually also include the Ministry of Interior and have a broader understanding. And I think that's the broader challenge for everyone. think about this outside of particular policy fields. And I think everything that Hanna has said about the EU is extremely relevant here, where we don't have this structure of ministry and where we have these complicated layers of interior and exterior, and where we have the area of freedom and security extremely relevant to these issues. And particularly if we think about migration, I think that's one of the main challenges that we have to tackle. How can we continue to build violent borders and then try to, on top of that, have some sort of gender mainstreaming, gender equality initiatives? So I think here we will have to go a lot deeper to think about insecurities, inequalities, and how the EU is actively contributing to some of them.
Thank you very much. We've already discussed for more than 1 hour. I think it's a good point that we actually finish here. If someone wants to add anything. If not, then I will just say that we covered a lot of issues, and I would maybe conclude with 3 points that all of you made at some point of time, by saying that feminist foreign policy is not only about gender equality, it is very much about mindset change, about different discourse within the foreign policy. It's about cooperation of all the sectors. That's exactly what we've done here today with academics, diplomats, and civil society. And it is also about active participation and critical thinking about how we're doing things. So thank you very much again for this discussion and for your participation. I hope we will continue following this agenda and meet again at some point of time. Thank you and bye-bye.